I'm Joanne Curry. I'm Vice President of External Relations, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose traditional territories that we're very privileged to be here tonight and to live, work, and play. Welcome to Simon Fraser University's Harbour Centre campus, part of our vibrant Vancouver campus. We're celebrating our 30th year this year, and to this evening's Munro Lecture with Kathleen Fitzpatrick. The Munro Lecture is an annual address that brings leading scholars to SFU in recognition of our former VP academic and provost, Jock Munro, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight due to illness. As many of you know, SFU has made it our vision to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, and today's lecture is part of SFU Public Square, a signature initiative of the Engaged University vision, and we're pleased to have Janet Weber here, our Executive Director of SFU Public Square. The goals of Public Square are to provide a venue for informed dialogue, a gathering space for discussion, debate, and civic engagement. By providing these opportunities and also to hear from leading thinkers, these lectures are designed to enlighten and promote dialogue and on important issues of public interest. There's going to be a chance afterwards to provide comments and raise questions, and there'll also be a reception afterwards as well that you can continue discussion. The lecture will be filmed and available on SFU's YouTube channel if you want to refer it to others or watch it again. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Juan Pablo Alperin to introduce our speaker. Juan is a professor of publishing studies at SFU and an associate researcher with the Public Knowledge Project. This project is a multi-university initiative that develops free open source software and conducts research to improve the quality and reach of scholarly publishing. His research interests include open access and scholarly communication, with a particular focus on circulation and impact of research outside of academia. Last year, he used his expertise and insight to deliver the President's Dream Colloquium on making knowledge public. It was very successful and felt that this topic was very fitting for a Munro Lecture. So tonight we are pleased to host an encore presentation or an additional issue of the President's Dream Colloquium on making knowledge public. Please join me in welcoming Juan Pablo Alperin.
Thanks, Joanne. It does feel like just yesterday that I was standing here in front of you introducing speakers for the President's Dream Colloquium on making knowledge public. And it is always, continues to be such a pleasure and such a treat to have the opportunity to welcome those scholars that we admire the most to come and speak and to have them share their insights and their ideas with new audiences. It is, in this evening, we have one of such occasions, such a treat for me, and I think it's going to be a treat for all of you to hear Kathleen Fitzpatrick. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is a Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. Prior to assuming this role in 2017, she served as the Associate Executive Director and Director of Scholarly Communications at the Modern Language Association. She's also held appointments as a visiting research professor of English at NYU and a visiting professor of media at Coventry University. Kathleen is the author of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, as well as The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American Novel in the Age of Television. Her most recent book, Generous Thinking, A Radical Approach to Saving the University, whose title might sound familiar to you, is due out, or actually might actually already be out. I'm getting conflicting information as whether it's coming out on Tuesday or whether it's available as of this weekend. So just so you know, or at very least it's available on pre-order right now. So she is also the project director of the Humanities Common, an open access and open source network serving more than 50,000 scholars and practitioners within the humanities, as well as the co-founder of the digital scholarly network Media Commons, where she led a number of experiments in open peer review and other innovations in scholarly publishing. All this to say that I could not be more thrilled to welcome Kathleen, and I hope you join me in welcoming her to the stage. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Juan and Heather and everyone else who was involved in bringing me here to talk with you today. I'm really thrilled to be here. The talk is a highly compressed overview of sorts of the book by the same name, which Johns Hopkins tells me is supposed to be and Amazon tells me is supposed to be released on Tuesday. There are early copies floating about. And if you saw their little generous thinking business cards on the table out here on the backside, there is a 20% discount code if you want to order it directly from the publisher. They would be happy if I told you that. So anyway, the overall argument of the project is that the future of higher education demands that those of us on campus pay more attention to building relationships of trust with the publics that the university serves. My focus in the book is particularly on the future of the American university, but I think much of it holds for those other nations that seem unfortunately to be following our relentless course toward austerity and privatization in higher education. Now, evidence of the need for rebuilding trusting relationships between universities and the public might be found in an increasing number of reports and studies such as this one, which was released in 2017 by the Pew Research Center, and which shows a precipitous decline in the esteem that colleges and universities are held in the United States, and especially on the political right. Now, one frequent on-campus reaction to this kind of report, understandably, is to decry the rampant anti-intellectualism in contemporary culture, to turn inward, and to spend more time talking with those who understand us, meaning us. Right? But in that reaction, we run the risk of deepening the divide, allowing those who want to argue that today's colleges and universities are not only irrelevant, but actively detrimental to the well-being of the general public to say, see, they're out of touch, who needs them anyway? Because this shift in public opinion that we see in very dim graphs like this one, I'm sorry about that, didn't just happen on its own. It was made to happen. Now, from time to time, we're confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, even those institutions that most profess their commitment to public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that the public has placed in them. Which is to say that the problem is not just that the public doesn't understand the importance of what we do on campus. It's also that we have in many ways failed. We failed to make that importance clear. We failed to protect our communities, both on campus and off. We failed to build institutions that are genuinely, structurally capable of living out the values that they profess. So a large part of what I'm after in generous thinking is to press for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as in interaction with communities, asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate both with one another and with a range of broader publics about and around our work. Asking us, in other words, to examine how our colleges and universities engage with the world. And some focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I would suggest, because our institutions are facing a panoply of crises that we cannot solve on our own. Now, these crises, I want to acknowledge, do not always give the impression of being life-threatening or world historical or approaching the kind or degree of the highly volatile political, economic, and environmental situation that we face today. And yet, the decline in public support for higher education is of a piece with these other crises, part of a series of national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good. Right? The fact, in fact, or the very notion, in fact, that there can be such a thing as the public good. And the consequences of those transformations are indeed life or death in many cases. So while some might take my argument about the importance of generosity for the future of the university to be a self-indulgent, head-in-the-sand retreat into philosophizing and a refusal of real political action, I hope in the larger project to have put together a case for why this is not so. Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I'm asking us to undertake within and around our institutions of higher education have the potential to help us navigate navigate the present crises. Many of our fields, after all, are already working in publicly engaged ways. And my argument is that we need to generalize that engagement and to think about the ways that it might, if permitted, transform the institution and the ways that we work within it. That is to say, the best of what the university has to offer may lie less in its ability to advance knowledge or solve problems in any of its many particular fields than in our more crucial ability to be a model and a support for generous thinking as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, but first, who is this we that I keep talking about, and what is it precisely that we do, and why does it matter? Much of my argument focuses on the university's permanent faculty, partially because that faculty is my community of practice, and partially because of the extent to which the work done by the faculty is higher education. Research and teaching are the primary purposes and visible outputs of our institutions. Moreover, the principles of shared governance under which we operate, at least in theory, suggest that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the university. But I do want to be careful with the ways that I deploy this we. As Helen Small has pointed out, the first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. So while I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but are not faculty, or who do not work on university campuses at all, and I hope that it might become possible for the we that I'm addressing on some level to begin to refer to all of us, on campus and off, who want to strengthen both our systems of higher education and our ways of engaging with one another in order to help us all build stronger communities. But it's important nonetheless to acknowledge that the we that bears the greatest responsibility for caring for the university and for building relationships between the university and the broader publics that it serves, and thus the most immediate antecedent for my we, is those of us on campus, and especially the faculty. Now, of course, every we implies a them. And the ways that we define and conceive of that them, I think, points to one of the primary problems of the contemporary university, and especially public universities in the United States. These institutions were founded explicitly to serve the people of their states or their regions or their communities, and thus those publics should be understood as part of us. And yet, the borders of the campus have done more than define a space. Right? They determine a sense of belonging as well, transforming everything off campus into them, a generalized other that at times gets imagined to be the audience for our performances, a passive group that takes in the information that we provide. I mean, what might it mean if we understood them as a complex collection of communities, not just groups who interact with one another and with us, but groups, in fact, of which we are a part? How might this lead to a richer sense, not just of them, but of the us that we together form? Now, we talk a lot, after all, on campus about community. We talk about community engagement and about the university itself as a community. But we don't talk a lot about what it is that we mean when we evoke this concept. Miranda Joseph explores the ways in which the notion of community has been mythologized. It's been romanticized. And so it's come to serve what she calls a supplementary role with respect to capitalism. It sort of fills the gaps and smooths over the flaws in ways that permit the status quo to function without real opposition. So community in the singular, the community, in the way that Joseph writes about it, runs the risk of becoming a kind of disciplinary force, right? A declaration of groupness, that it is designed to produce the us that inevitably suggests a them. Now, if we are able to understand community instead as multiple and multifarious, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might be able to think of community as an activity instead, as a practice of solidarity, as a process of coalition building. And this sense of solidarity is a key part of the university's recent past, one of the important elements of its history that's been undone by recent political shifts. As Roderick Ferguson has detailed, the student-led calls for institutional change in the 1960s and 1970s in many ways focused on the potential that the university held and failed to meet for connecting with the communities around it. Instead, our institutions have turned inward, they've become self-protective, they've looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve. So community in this strategic sense is and has been the university's weakness when it should have been its strength. If we're to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that threaten to undo them, we have to begin to understand the campus as a site where new kinds of communities and new kinds of solidarities can be built. However, in building those relationships, we have to contend with the fact that what faculty members actually do on our campuses is often a mystery, and indeed a site of profound misunderstanding for people outside the academic profession, and even at times for one another. One of the key areas of misunderstanding, and one that most needs opening up, I think, is the fundamental purpose of higher education. Public figures such as politicians, especially in the US, again, increasingly discuss colleges and universities as sites of workforce preparation, making it seem as though the provision of career-enhancing credentials were the sole purpose for which our institutions exist, and as if everything else that they do that does not lead directly to economic growth were a misappropriation of resources. Now, those of us who work on campus understand our institutions not as credentialing agencies, but as sites of broad-based education, right? A liberal education in the original sense of the term. Now, of course, the very term liberal education, which is so natural to those of us who've been engaged in it, has itself become profoundly politicized, as if the liberal aspect of higher education were not its breadth, but its ideological bent. So we start seeing, for instance, the state of Colorado stripping the term out of official university documents. But even where the concept of liberal education isn't imagined to be a cover for some revolution that we're secretly fomenting on campus, there's nonetheless a widespread misconception about it that's almost worse, that liberal education is a mode of education in which we waste taxpayer resources by developing, disseminating, and filling our students' heads with useless knowledge that will not lead to a productive career path. And nowhere is this misconception more focused than on the humanities. Now, the portrait that I'm about to sketch of the humanities today could be extended to many other areas within the curriculum. For example, the sciences focus on basic science, right, or science without direct industry applicability, is often imagined to be just as frivolous. But the humanities, the study of literature, art, history, philosophy, and other forms of culture, are in certain ways both the core and the limit case of the liberal arts. The humanities cultivate an inquisitive mindset. They teach key skills of reading and interpretation, and they focus on writing in ways that can prepare a student to learn absolutely anything over the course of the rest of their lives. And yet these are the fields around which no end of hilarious jokes about what a student might actually do with that degree have been constructed. Now, the answer to those jokes is, of course, absolutely anything. As a recent report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences makes clear, not only do humanities majors wind up gainfully employed, but they also wind up happy in what they do. But I digress, right? The key thing to note is that the humanities serve as a bellwether of sorts. What has been happening to them is happening to higher education in general, if just a little more slowly. So while I focus a bit on the kinds of arguments that are being made about the humanities in our culture today, it doesn't take too much of a stretch to imagine them being made about sociology, or about physics, or about any other field on campus that isn't named after a specific well-paying career. So the humanities, in any case, have long been lauded as providing students with a rich set of interpretive, critical, and ethical skills with which they can engage the world around them. And these skills are increasingly necessary in today's hyper-mediated, globalized, conflict-filled world. And yet many humanities departments feel themselves increasingly marginalized within their own institutions. And this marginalization is related, if not directly attributable, that was harder than I thought it was going to be, attributable, to the degree to which students, parents, administrators, trustees, politicians, the media, and the public at large have been led in a sort of self-reinforcing cycle to believe that the skills that these fields provide are useless in the current economic environment. Now, someone particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about all those English majors working at Starbucks. Commentators reinforce the sense that humanities majors are worth less than pre-professional degrees. Parents strongly encourage their students to turn toward pragmatic fields that seem somehow to describe a job. Administrators note a decline in humanities majors and cut budgets and positions. The jobs crisis for humanities PhDs worsens. Someone particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about what all those adjuncts were planning on doing with that humanities PhD anyhow, and the whole thing intensifies. And in many institutions, this draining away of majors and faculty and resources has reduced the humanities to a means of ensuring that students studying to become engineers and bankers are reminded of the human ends of their work. Now, that's not a terrible thing in and of itself, but it's not a sufficient ground on which humanities fields can do their best work for the institution. And while this kind of cyclical crisis has not manifested to anything like the same extent in the sciences, there are early indications that it may be spreading in that direction. I mean, where once the world at large seemed mostly to understand that scientific research and the kinds of study that support it are crucial to the general advancement of knowledge, recent shifts in funder priorities and policies suggest a growing scrutiny of that work's economic rather than educational impact, as well as a growing restriction on research areas that have been heavily politicized. The humanities, again, may well be the canary in the higher education coal mine. And for that reason, I think it's crucial that we pay close attention to what's happened in those fields, and particularly to the things that haven't worked as the humanities have attempted to remedy the situation. So one of the key things that hasn't worked is the impassioned plea on behalf of humanities fields. A welter of defenses of the humanities from both inside and outside the academy have been published in recent years, each of which has seemed slightly more defensive than the last, and none of which has had the desired impact. Calls to save the humanities issued by public figures frequently leave scholars annoyed, as they often begin with a somewhat retrograde sense of what it is we do and why, and thus frequently give the impression of trying to save our fields from us. One might see, for instance, a column published in 2016 by the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Bruce Cole, entitled "What's Wrong with the Humanities?", which begins memorably, "Let's face it, too many humanities scholars are alienating students and the public with their opacity, triviality, and irrelevance." Right. But perhaps even worse is the degree to which humanities professors themselves, right, those one would think best positioned to make the case, have failed to find traction with the arguments that we make. And as the unsuccessful defenses proliferate, the public view of the humanities becomes all the worse, leaving Simon During to grumble that whatever things the humanities do well, it is beginning to look as if promoting themselves is not among them. Right? And maybe we like it that way, right? As we are often those who take issue with our own defenses, bitterly disagreeing, as we do often, about the purposes and practices of our fields. So perhaps this is a good moment for us to stop and consider what it is the humanities do well, right? What the humanities are for. I'll start with a basic definition of the humanities as a cluster of fields that focus on the careful study and analysis of cultures and their many modes of thought and forms of representation, writing, music, art, media, and so forth, as they've developed and moved through time and across geographical boundaries, growing out of and adding to our senses of who we are as individuals, as groups, and as nations. The humanities are interested, then, in the ways that representations work, in the relationships between representations and social structures, in all the ways that human ideas and their expression shape and are shaped by human culture. And in this definition, we might begin to see the possibility that studying literature or history or art or film or philosophy might not be solely about that object itself, but instead about a way of engaging with the world. In the process, we develop the ability to read and interpret what we see and hear, the insight to understand the multiple layers of what is being communicated and why, and the capacity to put together for ourselves an appropriate, thoughtful contribution. Now, the first thing to note about this definition is that I am certain that many humanities scholars who hear it will disagree with it. They will have nuances and correctives to offer, and it's important to understand that this disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that my definition is wrong. Nor, however, do I mean to suggest that the nuances and correctives presented would be wrong. Rather, that form of disagreement is at the heart of how we do what we do, right? We hear one another's interpretations, whether of texts or performances or historical events, and we push back against them. We advance the work in our field through disagreement and through revision. But this agonistic approach, I want to argue, is both a strength of the humanities and, by extension, of the university in general, and its Achilles heel, a thought to which I'll return shortly. For the moment, though, back to Simon During and his sense that the humanities are terrible at self-promotion. During's complaint, levied at the essays included in Peter Brooks and Hilary Jewett's volume, The Humanities in Public Life, is largely that in the act of self-defense, humanities scholars leave behind doing what they do and instead turn to sermonizing, his word, about the value of what they do. He argues that part of the problem is the assumption that the humanities, as we practice them, ought to have a public life in the first place. And he winds up suggesting that we should continue to ensure that there's enough state support for the humanities so that students who do not already occupy a position of financial comfort can study our fields, but that we shouldn't stretch beyond that point, arguing for the public importance of the humanities because that importance is, for him, overwhelmingly private. This sense that education in the humanities is primarily of private value is everywhere in today's popular discourse extended to higher education in general. Right? The purpose, we are told, of a college degree is some form of personal enrichment, whether financial or otherwise, rather than a social good. And the privatization of higher education's benefits, part of the general privatization that Chris Newfield has referred to as the Academy's great mistake, has been accompanied by a similar shift in its costs from the state to individual families and students, resulting in the downward spiral in funding and other forms of public support in which our institutions and our fields are caught, as well as the astronomically increasing debt load faced by students and their families. As long as a university education is assumed to have a predominantly personal rather than social benefit, it will be argued that making such an education possible is a private rather than a public responsibility. And that mindset will of necessity lead to the devaluation of fields whose benefits are less immediately tangible, less material, less individual. If we are to correct course, if we are to restore support for our institutions and our fields, we have to find ways to make clear that the public goals that our fields have, or to make clear those public goals and the public good that our institutions serve. Okay, but what is that public good? We don't do a terribly good job of articulating these things. In fact, despite the role that so many of us have as professors, we often seem to have a really hard time professing describing what it is that we do and arguing on behalf of the values that we bring to and that sustain our work. I mean, it's hard to express those values without recourse to what feel to us like politically regressive, universalizing master narratives about the nature of the good that have long been used as means of solidifying and perpetuating the social order with all of its injustices and exclusions. And so instead of stating clearly and passionately the ethics and values and goals that we bring to our work, we critique. Right? We protect ourselves with what Lisa Ruddick has described as the game of academic cool. In order to avoid appearing naive or worse, complicit, we complicate, we argue, we read against the grain. Now, this mode of critique gets mistaken in public discourse for being primarily ideological in intent and effect. I mean, this is how our universities come to be accused of brainwashing their students, filling their heads with leftist rejections of the basic goodness of the dominant Western culture. Now, on campus, we know that's not the case. The political and social commitments behind our work are real, and they're crucial. But even our most critical reading practices turn out to be perfectly compatible with the contemporary political landscape. As Marco Roth has pointed out, the most critical methods of literary and cultural analysis have flourished, he says, in our period of triumphant neoliberalism, both within the university system and in the world at large. So in other words, our critiques of contemporary culture may not simply surface out of our social commitments. Rather, they surface not just despite, but in fact because of the conservative-leaning systems and structures in which the university as a whole, and each of us as a result, is mired. Our tendency to read against the grain is part of our makeup precisely because of the ways that we are ourselves subject to politics, rather than being able to stand outside and neutrally analyze the political. And the politics that we're subject to structures all institutions in the contemporary United States, for sure, and perhaps especially universities. A politics that makes inevitable the critical, the negative, the rejection of everything that's gone before. It's a politics that's structured around competition, and what historian Winfried Fluck has referred to as the race for individual distinction. However much we might reject individualism as part and parcel of the neoliberal mainstream, our working lives, both on campus and off, are overdetermined by it. The entire academic enterprise serves to cultivate individualism, in fact, beginning with college applications, extending through graduate school admissions, fellowship applications, the job market, publication submissions, and seemingly finally the tenure and promotion review. Those of us on campus are subject to selection. Right? The processes present themselves as meritocratic. Right? There are some metrics for quality against which applicants are measured, and the best, whatever that might mean in a given context, are rewarded. But in actual practice, those metrics are never neutral, and what we are measured against is far more often than not one another. Always, in the unconscious of the profession, there's competition for positions, for resources, for acclaim. And the drive to compete that this mode of being instills in us can't ever be fully contained by these specific processes. It bleeds out into all of the ways that we work, even when we're working together. The competitive individualism that the academy cultivates makes all of us painfully aware that even our most collaborative efforts will be assessed individually, with the result that even those fields whose advancement depends most on team-based efforts are required to develop careful guidelines for establishing credit and priority. Now, this competitive individualism contradicts and, in fact, undermines all of the most important communal aspects of life within our institutions of higher education. Our principles of shared governance, for instance, are built on the notion that universities operate best as collectives, in which all members contribute to their direction and functioning. But in actual practice, our all too clear understanding that service to the institution will not count when faculty are evaluated and ranked for salary increases and promotions encourages us to avoid that labor, to reserve our time and energy for those aspects of our work that will enable our individual achievement. And the results are not good for any of us. Faculty disengage from the functioning of the institution and the shared purposes that it serves, while university governance becomes increasingly managed by administrators, ostensibly freeing up the faculty to focus on the competitive work that will allow us as individuals and our universities as institutions to climb the rankings. This is no way to run a collective. It's also no way to structure a fulfilling life. This disengagement from community and race for individual distinction is a key factor in the extremely high risk of burnout among college faculty and other intellectual workers. It is all but impossible for us to structure our lives around the things that are most in line with our deepest personal values when we are driven to focus on those things that will allow us to compare ourselves or our institutions favorably with one another. And this individualistic competitive requirement, I believe, is inseparable from the privatization that Newfield describes as the political unconscious of the contemporary university. Competition and the race for individual distinction structure the growing conviction that not only the benefits of higher education, but also all of our categories of success can only ever be personal, private, individual, rather than social. And no amount of trying to persuade ourselves or our administrations or our legislatures of the public good that we, our fields, and our institutions serve can really take root unless we figure out how to step off that competitive track, to insist on living our academic lives another way. Worse, scholars' internalization of the individualistic imperative to compete, I think, has provided an inroads into higher education for some forces that are hastening its disintegration. Bill Redding's in the 90s, in The University in Ruins, powerfully traces the transition of the purposes of higher education from the propagation of the culture of the nation state and the training of its citizens therein, through an important period of resistance and protest that did the crucial work of opening up both access to higher education and the canon that it taught, to its current role, which seems to be the production of value, both intellectual and human, for global capital. Right? Which is to say that many of our critiques of our fields and our institutions are well-founded. They were developed in order to cultivate a particular model of citizenship based on exclusion and oppression and focused on the reproduction of state power. The problem is that in the absence of such a clear, if problematic, goal, the purpose of higher education has drifted. And as in so many other areas of the contemporary public world where the state has lost authority, corporate interests have interceded. The university may no longer promote exclusion and oppression in training state citizens, but it reinstantiates it in a new guise by turning to training corporate citizens. And even worse, rejecting or critiquing that purpose simply isn't working. Not only is capital extraordinarily able to absorb all critique and marginalize those who make it, but our inability to stop competing with one another ensures that our critique is contained within the forces of the market that we serve, right? So perhaps we might have reached, as Rita Felsky suggests, the limits of critique. Perhaps we need to adopt a new mode of approach in order to make a dent in the systems that hem us in. Now, this is not to say that I am rejecting critique or critical thinking. Critical thinking is at the heart of what scholars do. Not only would we be justified in rejecting any suggestion that we abandon it or that we abandon the commitments that underwrite it in favor of an approach that might be more friendly, but we'd also be well within reason if we were to point out that the critique of critique is still critique, right? That it makes use of criticism's negative mode in the very act of negating it. And moreover, the critique of critique is too often driven either by a disdain for difficulty or by a rejection of the political in scholarly work. But I do want to suggest that though these rejections and dismissals undoubtedly lie behind the calls for comprehensibility and the return to tradition in work in the humanities in particular, and we can see again Bruce Cole on that, That's not the only thing behind those calls, I don't think. These calls may at least be, in part, a sign of the degree to which people care about the stuff we study, right? Whether it's literature or history or art. It might indicate the degree to which people want, on some level, to engage with us in the ways they feel rejected by us. Now, there is grave political opposition to much of the work that's done on our college campuses today, and I do not at all wish to dismiss the threat that that opposition can pose. But I also want to suggest that even that glimmer of care for our subject matter creates the opportunity, if we take it seriously, to create forms of connection and dialogue that might help further rather than stymie the work that we do. So some of my thinking about the ways that attention to care like this might encourage scholars to approach the work that we do from a slightly different direction has developed out of a talk that I heard a couple of years ago by David Scobie, who was then the dean of the New School for Public Engagement. His suggestion was that scholarly work in the humanities is in a kind of imbalance, that critical thinking has dominated at the expense of a more socially directed mode of what he called generous thinking. And that a recalibration of the balance between the two might enable us to make possible a greater commitment in our work, a greater public commitment in our work, which in turn might inspire a greater public commitment to our work. So my project, having drawn its title from Scobie, obviously builds on this argument, but with one key revision. Right? Generous thinking is not and should not be opposed to critical thinking. In fact, the two should be fully aligned, and my hope is to guide us toward ways of working that enable us to more fruitfully connect the generous and the critical in scholarly work. Rather, the dark opposite of generous thinking, that which has, in fact, created an imbalance in scholarly work, is competitive thinking. Right? Thinking that is compelled by what sociologist and economist Thorstein Veblen called invidious comparison, or what Fluke refers to as the race for professional distinction. It's the competitive that has undermined our capacity for coalition building, both within our campuses and between our campuses and the broader public. Entirely new discussions, new relationships, new projects might be possible if our critical thinking practices refused competition and were instead grounded in generosity. So what is it that I mean when I talk about generosity in this context? The book spends a lot more time exploring this question, and I'm going to abbreviate quite a lot here. But what I'm hoping to develop in myself most of all is really a generosity of mind, right? An openness to possibility. And that openness begins for me by trying to develop a listening presence in the world, which is to say, a conversational disposition that's not merely waiting for my next opportunity to speak, but instead genuinely focusing on what's being said to me, beginning from the assumption that in any given exchange, I likely have less to teach than I have to learn. Generous thinking also means learning to work with rather than against one another, whether the objects of the things that we're working with rather than against are texts or people. It means starting an encounter with an idea, with a text or an idea with yes rather than no, with and rather than but. This yes and creates the possibility for genuine dialogue, not just among academic colleagues, but with our objects of study, with our predecessors, and with the many potential publics that surround us. Now, this mode of generous thinking is already instantiated in a lot of public projects that focus on fostering public engagement in and through the work that's being done in colleges and universities. And public projects like these are well established on many campuses around the country and many places like this, in many fields across the curriculum. But one key aspect of understanding generosity as the ground from which the work of the university can and should grow is that the requirement that all of us on campus take such public projects just as seriously as we do the more traditional forms of scholarly work that circulate amongst ourselves. Scholars working in public history, just as one example, have some really important stories to tell about the difficulties that they've faced in getting work in that field appropriately evaluated and credited as scholarship. And a few years ago, after a talk in which a well-respected scholar discussed the expanding possibilities for careers in the public humanities, I overheard a senior scholar say with some bemusement, I take the point, but I don't think it works in all fields. I mean, there's long been a public history, but can you imagine a public literary criticism? His interlocutor chortled bemusedly, the very idea. But the world has long been filled with public literary criticism, from public reading projects to book reviews to fan production, modes of literary work that reach out to non-specialist audiences and draw them into the kinds of interpretation and analysis that we profess. Resistance to taking these kinds of projects just as seriously as the work that we do for one another and according them the same kinds of credit and prestige as traditional publications speaks to a couple of things. Our anxieties about deprofessionalization and our continued, and I would argue profoundly misguided, division and ordering of the various categories to which academic labor is committed, with a completely distinct category called service, almost always coming in a distant third behind research and teaching. Grounding our work in a spirit of generosity might lead us to erase some of the boundaries between the work that faculty do to support the engagements of readers and instructors both inside and outside the academy, and the work that we consider to be genuinely scholarly. But a proper valuation of public engagement in scholarly life will require a systematic rethinking of the role that prestige plays in the academic reward system. And this, as I discuss late in the book, is no small task, right? But it is crucial to a renewed understanding of the relationship between the university and the public good. There's a whole lot more to be said here, and I recognize that the hour is drawing late, so I'm going to move a little bit quickly through these last few slides. Grounding our work in generous thinking, I think, is going to require us to think differently about the nature of collaboration in academic life. I mean, it might encourage us to really think about the ways that we make our work open at earlier stages, so that it can be more readily available and usable by readers, but also so that it can draw more people into the formation of the work itself, really generatively thinking with audiences about work rather than simply handing work over to be consumed. I want to acknowledge that the mode of generous thinking that I'm suggesting is both really difficult and easily dismissible. We're accustomed to finding smart ways of thinking that rebut, that question, that complicate. And the kinds of listening and openness that I'm advocating here may at times seem naive, or may seem like a politically regressive knuckling under to the pressures of contemporary ideologies and institutions. I mean, this is the sense in which Rita Felsky suggests that scholars have really internalized the assumption that whatever is not critical must therefore be uncritical. Felsky posits that the critical is a mood in which scholarship gets done, one to which we have limited ourselves at great cost. I would reorient her argument to focus again not on the critical as the dominant mood of our work, but instead the competitive, the costs of which are astronomical, not only to each individual scholar in setting that course toward stress-related burnout, but also to scholars collectively in undermining our ability to understand ourselves as a community, one capable of disagreeing profoundly, and yet still coming together in solidarity to argue for our collective interests. So what might be possible for us if we were to retain the social commitment that motivates our critical work while stepping off the field of competition? One of the things that we would need to do if we were to create that opening would be to place ourselves in a new relationship to our objects of study and their many audiences. I mean, we would need to be prepared to listen to what they have to tell us, to ask questions that are designed to elicit more about their interests than about ours. And that is to say that we would have to open ourselves to the possibility that our ideas might turn out to be wrong. And this, it might not surprise you to hear, is an alarming possibility, not just for most scholars, but for most human beings to countenance. As Catherine Schultz has brilliantly explored, it is a possibility that we will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid facing. But given the ways that arguments in our fields proceed, and given what Schultz has called the pessimistic meta-induction from the history of everything, I mean, it is all but certain that at some future moment, our own blind spots or biases or points of general ignorance will have been uncovered. Right? Refusing to countenance the possibility of this wrongness today makes it all the more inevitable. But perhaps keeping it in view might open us to some new opportunities. I mean, if everything that we write today already bears within it a future anterior in which it will have been demonstrated to be wrong-headed, there opens up the chance to explore a new path. Right, one along which we develop not just a form of critical audacity, but also a kind of critical humility. And this, I think, is one key to generous thinking. In the early days of working on this project, I gave an invited talk in which I tested out a few of its core ideas. And in the Q&A period that followed, one commenter pointed out what he saw as a really canny move on my part in talking about generosity, because no one wanted to be seen as an ungenerous jerk in the Q&A period. It was a funny moment, but it gave me pause because I didn't intend to use generosity as a shield with which to fend off the possibility of critique. Generosity, in fact, requires remaining open to criticism. And this tension was powerfully illustrated for me in a series of tweets from April Hathcock about a year ago. April's a scholarly communications librarian who was working with a new group in her field. And as the members of that working group were coming together and laying out their expectations and their norms for how they were going to work, one member offered, assume positive intent. Right? Be generous, in other words, in interpreting the behavior and words of others. Now, Hathcock insisted that this expectation be accompanied by another, own negative effects. Right? Which is to say, we must not only refrain from assuming that everyone else is in the wrong, but we also must remain open to the very possibility that we might be. This is generosity accompanied by critical humility, a mode that creates the space for genuinely listening to the ideas and experiences of others, even when they contradict or critique our own. Now, it's probably unnecessary to point out that critical humility is neither selected for nor encouraged in graduate school, and quite the opposite, in fact. Everything in the environment of the seminar room makes flirting with being wrong unthinkable. So this real critical humility can create new space for discovery, but only if we're willing to deal with the discomfort, right, of potentially being wrong. This is difficult, and I don't want to suggest that it's not, but genuine generosity in the way that I intend it is not a feel-good emotion, right? It's an at times painful, failure-filled process of what Dominic LaCapra has referred to as empathic unsettlement, which asks us to open ourselves to the possibility of difference without trying to tamp it down into understanding, right? It's an ethical form of engagement that I think can really be a hallmark of the university if we open ourselves and our institutions to the opportunities that genuinely being in community can present. So I have a long list of what-ifs here that I'm going to spare you at this point. You know, what if our institutions were able to think collaboratively as institutions rather than understanding themselves as being in competition with one another? What possibilities might we open up for really thinking about what the public support of higher education looks like? I mean, if we were able to demonstrate that formation of community and that building of solidarity, both within our campuses, between our campuses and the surrounding communities, and across multiple campuses. I mean, what new purposes for the university might we imagine if we were encouraged to think together more than thinking competitively? All of these possibilities begin with, I believe, cultivating the ability to think generously, right? To listen to one another, to listen to our subject matter, to listen to our communities and to ourselves. And there's, you know, a lot more to say. There's a whole book's worth available on Tuesday. But this listening presence in the end, in which I am perfectly willing to countenance the possibility that I might just be wrong, is where I will now leave myself ready to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think, as she said, she's willing to take a few questions from the audience. So we do have a couple of mic runners around. So if you'd just like to ask a question, and the only thing I ask is just keep your questions to a question and keep them and so that we can hear Kathleen's thoughts on it. So we've got one. Let's see if we can get the orange hat over on the.
Hi, I have one question. So we talk about eliminating competition, like reducing it, but wouldn't that affect the course of innovation? Wouldn't, because I mean, to me, one of the drivers of trying to find new things is to be the first one to be awarded that, to get that prestige. So if you try to, you have a more collaborative spirit, maybe innovation might be stifled a little bit. I don't know.
I don't know. It may be Pollyanna-ish of me to think not. I mean, I do want to say that this talk does only present one face of competition. There is an extraordinarily healthy aspect to competition. And particularly, you know, if you think about competition in the sense of team-based sports and the things that one learns as a member of a team in terms of, you know, coming together, working really hard, being a good loser, right? These are all absolutely important, and they're all based in that spirit of competition. But it's a friendly competition and not a competition for scarce resources, right? And it's that scarcity of resources for which we are driven to compete 24/7 that I think becomes the problem, right? So I would love for us to think about a world of scientific advancement in which like the prestige isn't necessarily in being first. Why do we need to be the one, right? Taking the next step beyond the one, being the second one who is able to do something additive to that is equally important and equally crucial for advancement. And so right now, I mean, the issue with being the one, being the first to do something is precisely that's where the institutional reward structures lie, right? You get that Nobel Prize and you know you're set. And institutions brand themselves based on how many Nobel laureates they have on campus, right? So there is this constant sense of prestige that we and our institutions are jockeying for. And I just want to say that that's a misguided principle, right? It does contribute to pressing innovation and science forward, but at enormous cost. And particularly at enormous cost within institutions, because there is a race for resources, for research time, for other kinds of funding and space that end up putting others in the position of picking up parts of the community-based workload that in fact all of us need to share, right? So if prestige lay somewhere else, if the thing that we genuinely valued, if the thing that we marked as excellence were based on our values rather than on being the first, that I think would be something worth working toward.
Question at the front here.
Thanks. Just one quick comment about the competition piece, which is there's a relationship between competition and cooperation. And so if you think the best teams in a league, the ones that are most competitive have the most cooperative players. So what we have to do is move competition up a level or two so that we're talking about competition as a country or even at the institutional level and create cooperation at the level within the institution. So that just in that regard. But my comment and my question is, so I agree with everything you've said, and I've long thought, where are the tipping points to move us in this direction towards generous thinking? One comment I heard from an indigenous, a member of an indigenous community who wanted to be able to bring their research to the university is the university doesn't have a front door.
No.
So what if we thought about creating front doors for our universities so that community had a place to enter and identify those who they might want to be able to work with, those generous thinkers on campus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's one thing. And then as an old fart academic, I feel like it's my responsibility actually to do this kind of work because the younger generation can't afford to do it because the institution is still so solidly in that individualistic thinking. So, but how are we going to change the institutions? Where can we nudge the institutions so that my younger colleagues can do this kind of work? Because they're keen to do it, but then they get crushed by the system.
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that needs to happen is a top to bottom rethinking of tenure and promotion standards, right? That we really need to stop and make sure that things that we're rewarding faculty for are the things that we actually value, right? Rather than rewarding quantitative achievement met by several metrics that we may or may not actually believe in. Well, here's the question, right? I was at a meeting a couple of years ago that was keynoted by the provost of a really large West Coast institution that's highly visible. And he was talking about the recent recommitment of his campus to the public mission, right? That they recognized that there had been this great divide created between the public that they were serving or supposed to be serving and the campus. And so, you know, they'd rewritten their mission statement and their values, and they were rethinking openness and the ways that the university could engage the public in much more robust ways. And it was really great. I mean, he was talking about the value of open scholarship and public communication and the ways that this was going to support those goals. And then somebody asked about tenure and promotion. And it was like the lights got dimmed and he said, well, you know, we need to make sure our faculty are still publishing in the most highly ranked areas and that they're really, you know, that we're able to demonstrate the excellence of the faculty in that regard. And I asked him, I said, well, you know, what would it be for the provost of a very highly visible, enormous state institution to gather the entire faculty, top to bottom, you know, provosts, many vice provosts, deans, chairs, everybody, and say we're rewriting all of the promotion and tenure standards because this university has decided that our public mission is job one. And so whatever it is y'all decide, excellence is in research. It needs to have the public mission at its heart. Whatever excellence is in teaching, it needs to have the public mission at its heart. Like, what would you reward in a case like this? And he stood there for a second and he looked at me and said, any institution that did that would immediately lose competitiveness within its cohort. And it's true. He's not wrong. That's the worst of it, right? So what's it going to take? It's going to take an extremely brave president with a hardworking provost who is willing to step forward and say, I don't care about the rankings. The rankings do not matter. The public mission matters, right? It's going to take institutions coming together, and it's going to take several of them, because one institution can do this and everybody goes, Reed has decided not to participate in US News and World Reports again. That's very cute. But if 5 of them do it, you know, that's serious. And so, you know, I look at something like Ghent University in Belgium, having recently announced that it is no longer participating, as it says, in the ranking of humans, that it is just rewarding excellent work and that it is rethinking all of its standards. And I want to see that. I want to see that catch on, right? So it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take presidents being braver than they often are. Right? And they're in positions where they're not allowed to be brave because the people to whom they are reporting require metrics of achievement that are very much in this competitive individualism. I'm going to shut up now. I'm talking too much, but that, you know, you see this is extremely important.
Okay, there's a question at the back right from the very get-go. So maybe we can get a mic to the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you for your idea. Your ideas are very interesting, but I'm wondering with the predatory capitalism and the dominant narrative of economic self-interest are prevailing, and that put a lot of people in survival mode. Mm-hmm. So your ideas of general thinking sound wonderful, but when people are in the survival mode, they are more likely to be the battle between the ego and the superego, and the Lord the Fly syndrome will come out, and usually the id will come out. So I wonder how, if people will have the energy to follow the idea of general thinking.
Well, you know, that's a really important question. I hope so. And I mean, one of the places that I look near the end of the book for an example of both like where things have gone wrong and how we might build on the connection between the university and the public in order to sustain the work that the university is doing is the state of Wisconsin, right? Wow, I've forgotten his name already. Scott Walker, the now former governor of Wisconsin. The university was radically undermined, and it was undermined through austerity, and it was undermined through attempting to undermine tenure, and it you know, lost a tremendous number of faculty. It was an enormous problem, and the university suffered greatly for it. But Wisconsin had had for more than a century, the University of Wisconsin system was founded on what was known as the Wisconsin idea, which is that the public institutions of higher education in that state were owned by the people of that state. They belonged to the people of that state. There was an outreach in every area of the curriculum on the Wisconsin campuses to the public to make sure that the entire state is involved in what's going on. And you see in news reports from the time of Walker slashing and burning the university budget, people getting angrier and angrier about it and saying, this university is our university. You cannot do this to us. And it's that public anger, that solidarity between the voting public and the university that I think we've got to do a much better job of fostering. Wisconsin turned out Scott Walker, not before he had a chance to do a whole lot of damage. And there's a lot of correction that's got to happen now. But the people of the state voted to say that that won't stand, right? We need to build those coalitions so that the people will vote with us.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think we'll end the Q&A there. So thank you very much. And so I'm going to invite you all to stick around. But before I do, let me invite Joanne Curry back on the stage to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Kathleen, for such a fascinating lecture, and I really appreciate also the great questions asked by the audience. As mentioned, we're going to have a reception at the back of the room, so I hope many of you can stay on and continue discussion. And I wanted to just highlight an important event that's happening. SFU Public Square is having its 7th annual Community Summit, runs from April 10th to 18th. It's a very timely topic. It's called Confronting the Disinformation Age. It's going to explore how proliferation of disinformation is impacting society and challenging citizens' ability to make informed decisions about their economic, social, and political lives. About mid-February, they're going to have all the details, but if you read the Vancouver Sun, there was this fabulous article about the April 16th event at the Queen E, and I think there were like 800 tickets sold in 48 hours. If you truly want to go to this, and it'll feature David Frum, Sue Gardner, and Christopher Wiley. Get your tickets soon because they're going very fast. So again, thank you for coming out tonight, and I look forward to, I hope many of you join us at the reception. Thank you.